It rises from the landscape not as a house, but as an announcement, a deliberate expression of power shaped in stone, timber, and ambition. Nothing about it suggests hesitation. The building stands with a confidence so absolute that it seems to press outward into the air around it, as if even the horizon must acknowledge its presence. When it was born into the world, long before time and weather left their marks, this place embodied a kind of architectural certainty, an engineered conviction that it would remain here forever. From a distance, the mansion's silhouette reads like a carefully plotted geometry against the sky. Its long, horizontal sweep, the rhythmic lift of its chimneys, the anchored stance of its walls, everything feels positioned with the precision of a surveyor, drawing lines of influence rather than property boundaries. Even the angle at which it sits on the slope is no accident. The builders selected a placement that allowed the structure to command the land on every side, lifting it above the surrounding world, so that anyone approaching would see not only a residence, but a declaration. The mansion doesn't simply occupy high ground, it uses height as a form of authority. Up close, the materials reveal the scale of the ambition behind them. Heavy masonry, quarried with effort and shaped with care, forms the base of the structure, giving the sense that the house does not just stand on the land but grows out of it. Timber framing stretches across facades with disciplined confidence, clean lines meeting at sharp intersections that draw the eye along the building's vast length. Surfaces shift between polished and textured, smooth stucco beside rugged stone, each material placed to amplify the others. The result feels almost theatrical, yet nothing about it appears exaggerated. It is grandeur designed with restraint, forcefulness delivered through elegance. At the time of its construction, this mansion was not simply large, it was overwhelming. Its footprint spilled across the hillside with the calm inevitability of something destined to define its surroundings. Architects of the era often indulged in spectacle, but this house operated on a different principle. It conveyed status through scale and permanence rather than ornament. Its span could rival a city block. Windows opened toward commanding views, not for convenience, but to frame the world as if it belonged to the people inside. Standing at those windows in the earliest days, one would have seen unbroken stretches of valley, distant hills softened by haze, and the curve of water catching sunlight beyond the trees. It was as if the mansion had claimed the entire vista, as an extension of its architecture. Nothing in its composition hints at vulnerability. The chimneys rise like watchtowers, not merely functional, but symbolic, 12 pillars announcing to anyone within sight that this household was built on foundations deeper than wealth alone. Entrances are set back beneath broad arches, conveying the sense that those who pass through them were not merely arriving, but crossing into a carefully curated world. Steps are wide and confident, terracing the slope downward in measured layers that integrate the building with the earth, while keeping it unquestionably above those who approach. This mansion was a machine of status long before it was ever furnished or inhabited. Every door swing, every corridor angle, every threshold height was calculated to direct movement, shape impressions, and maintain an atmosphere of ceremonial precision. Even the approach roads, curved with deliberate slowness, force visitors into a controlled reveal. First, the tree-lined parts, then the gables rise. Then, at the final turn, the full length of the façade strikes you all at once, a visual impact so strong that it seems crafted for a moment of awe. Inside its first days of existence, the house radiated newness without fragility. It possessed the rare quality of looking as though it had always been there, as if the land had waited for it. It was not merely placed on the mountain, but enthroned upon it. This was a residence conceived not to blend with nature or echo history, but to dominate both. To stand before it was to feel the intention of its creator, a determination to carve permanence into the landscape, to leave a mark deeper than memory, to build something so certain that even time would have to negotiate its advance. And yet, beneath this imposing confidence, the mansion held a more subtle truth. Its position, scale, and presence were only the beginning. The story of how it connected to the land, how it came to exist in this exact place, and why its builders believed it could outlast them all, was only starting to unfold. The hillside, the breeze carrying from distant water, the surrounding valley, they formed the stage upon which the next part of its life would depend, shaping the destiny of a house that seemed too monumental to ever be humbled. The choice of the site was anything but accidental. Long before the first stone was laid, the hillside was studied with the precision of a strategist selecting ground for a fortress. The slope faced just enough to catch the rising light, yet held a shielded calm in the late afternoon, creating a natural theater where the mansion could sit as the central figure. Beneath the grass and soil lay a firm geological spine, stable enough to support enormous weight and resistant to the shifting patterns that plagued softer land below. This was not simply a pleasant location. It was a place that could carry the burden of a structure designed to be noticed, remembered, and respected. The curve of the valley surrounding the site created a visual frame that amplified whatever stood at its center. From the far side of the basin, the eye naturally climbed the incline and landed exactly where the future façade would rise. Even before construction, the land seemed to gesture toward that point, presenting it as the only possible stage for something extraordinary. Water nearby completed the composition, its surface reflecting changes in weather and light, sending a constant shimmer back toward the hillside. That subtle movement added life to the setting, the kind of presence that transforms stillness into atmosphere. To the builders and the family behind the project, the land was not simply terrain, it was an opportunity. The economic and social climate of the era demanded gestures of scale, and geography became a tool for expressing ambition. A visionary owner did not place a mansion where it was convenient. He placed it where it would broadcast stature. Elevation equaled distance from competition. Visibility equaled influence. The house needed to exist in a location where it could claim both advantages at once, and this hillside offered exactly that. A natural podium overlooking the valley, untouched by the noise and limitations of denser settlement. As survey stakes went into the ground, the concept became even clearer. The house would not adapt to the land. The land would be shaped to meet the needs of the house. Terraces would be carved, approaches orchestrated, sightlines cleared with a discipline that bordered on ritual. From the very beginning, the project conveyed the mindset of someone who planned not for comfort alone, but for legacy. The location spoke in the language of confidence, the kind that expects history to take note. Nothing about this choice was modest. It reflected an understanding that influence is most effective when it is undeniable. The builder wanted the landscape itself to serve as an introduction, guiding every visitor to the conclusion that this residence represented more than personal success. It was a statement made in topography, an architectural response to a world where power was measured not just by money, but by the scale and permanence of the structures that money could command. Choosing this slope, this horizon, this vantage point was therefore a strategic act. The mansion was intended to rise above ordinary homes, above ordinary expectations, and above the shifting currents of its time. The land became the first expression of that idea, a foundation not only of stone, but of ambition shaped into geography. The birth of the mansion began with an ambition so pronounced that every decision on the construction site, every beam lifted, every stone positioned, carried a kind of ceremonial weight. The workers who arrived at dawn quickly understood that this was no ordinary commission. The plans demanded precision far beyond typical residential design, and the expectations placed on the craftsmen were closer to those reserved for cathedrals and national monuments. The project had a single, unmistakable purpose: to create a structure that elevated its owner above peers, competitors, and even the landscape itself. Rare materials began arriving before the foundation was finished. Blocks of stone quarried specifically for their color consistency and resistance to weathering were transported at great cost from places miles away, because common masonry simply did not convey the message required. Timber beams were selected not from convenience or availability, but from forests known for producing the strongest, straightest cuts. Even the iron fittings, hinges, supports, brackets, were commissioned from specialized foundries. They weren't just functional components, they were symbols of a family willing to spend relentlessly to achieve permanence. Engineers of the period faced a challenge they welcomed: how to make a residence behave like a public monument. They designed reinforced substructures to keep the enormous footprint stable on the slope. They studied how weight would travel through the building so that the grand upper halls could stretch wider than usual without compromising the integrity of the floors below. ventilation systems were arranged with a sophistication rare for homes of the era, ensuring that the vast interior spaces remained temperate without the drafts that plagued lesser estates. Even the plumbing routes were planned as though they belonged in a luxury hotel, discreet, efficient, and resilient. Architectural techniques turned these engineering ideas into visible authority. The façade extended horizontally with a confidence few homes dared attempt, its long roofline echoing the horizon while simultaneously surpassing it. Gables projected forward like signatures carved into the skyline. Chimneys rose not only to serve fireplaces, but to punctuate the silhouette with the rhythm of a fortified manor. Window placements responded to the exact trajectory of the sun, drawing light into rooms in a way that dramatized their size and form. Each view through a doorway or archway was calculated so the eye would naturally follow a sequence of impressive reveals, as though the house were guiding guests through a carefully staged performance. The worksite buzzed with activity day after day, yet progress felt almost ceremonial. Carpenters shaped beams as if crafting instruments. Masons worked with a seriousness that suggested every stone would one day be inspected by history. Supervisors walked the grounds with rolled drawings held like sacred texts, protecting them from dust and weather. There was an atmosphere of inevitability around the whole enterprise, a shared sense that nothing less than architectural dominance would satisfy the vision behind it. Gradually, as walls climbed higher and the building began stretching across the hillside, a realization formed among those who watched from the valley below. The project wasn't aimed at comfort or simple habitation. Its purpose was larger, bolder. This mansion was being built to outlive the people who commissioned it, to shape the identity of the land, and stand as a public declaration long after private conversations faded. It was crafted not merely to shelter a family, but to secure a place in local legend. By the time the structure neared completion, the message was unmistakable. This was not a home built for everyday living. It was a masterpiece intentional in every gesture, designed to impress those who approached it, overpower those who tried to dismiss it, and outlast all who dared to compete with it. The mansion emerged not as a residence, but as an architectural titan, an artifact of ambition shaped into form. Stepping inside the mansion for the first time was an experience designed to override a visitor's expectations. The entrance did not simply open into a hall, it opened into an orchestrated moment. Light poured through high-set windows that filtered the sun into layered bands, guiding the eye upward before the visitor even had time to register the scale of the space. The ceilings soared with a confidence that dismissed any notion of domestic modesty. Their height making every footstep seem quieter, every breath more deliberate. This was not an interior meant to comfort. It was meant to declare. The grand hall stretched forward in a calculated line of symmetry, so precise that it felt almost ceremonial. Columns rose at measured intervals, framing the path through the space as though escorting each guest toward the deeper chambers of the home. Polished floors reflected the architecture in soft, wavering images, doubling the impression of height and width. The sensation of stepping across that gleaming surface was like stepping onto a stage, one where every movement might be observed, interpreted, and remembered. Corridors branched from the hall in deliberate axes, each one aligned with architectural clarity. These corridors did not meander. They traveled straight and unwavering, offering long, uninterrupted perspectives that pulled the viewer forward. At their ends, doorways acted like portals to new environments, small theatrical reveals engineered into the very bones of the house. Even the turning of a corner felt intentional, crafted to ensure that the next space emerged not accidentally, but with purpose. It was an architecture of anticipation, designed to make the interior unfold like a controlled performance. The major rooms radiating from the main axis were vast enough to host gatherings of extraordinary scale. The primary reception chamber, lined with carved wood and subtle decorative motifs, could hold an assembly large enough to rival the social halls of major hotels. Fireplaces big enough to stand within served as focal points, warming not only the room, but the sense of grandeur it projected. The ceilings carried panels and beams arranged in geometric patterns, each one reinforcing the theme of deliberate symmetry. When filled with guests, this room turned into a theater of influence, a space where the family could display its reach and shape conversations that echoed far beyond the mansion's walls. Beyond it, another space revealed itself, a music room engineered not merely for entertainment, but for spectacle. The acoustic shaping of the ceiling and walls hinted at careful study, allowing sound to travel with clarity and richness. Here, performances became another tool for asserting cultural authority. The family could host ensembles and small orchestras, using art itself as a currency of status. In an era when refinement signaled power as much as wealth, this room functioned as a visible declaration of cultivated taste. Even smaller spaces were designed with intent. The morning room, bright with natural light, created an atmosphere of effortless grace. The dining hall, paneled in dark, quietly luminous wood, wrapped guests in a sense of gravity and ceremony. Each interior had its own emotional temperature, its own role in the choreography of the household. Nothing was random. Every chamber carried the imprint of an owner who understood that influence often lives in the details. What tied all these interiors together was a philosophy, one that prized impression over intimacy, spectacle over simplicity. The house was a stage on which social identity was constructed, reinforced, and displayed. Its halls encouraged awe, its rooms encouraged admiration, and its sequence of spaces encouraged a sense of being guided through a hierarchy encoded in architecture. Visitors did not wander. They progressed, as though the mansion itself were teaching them how to move within it. Yet behind this parade of grandeur lay another, less visible layer of design. The very structure that dazzled guests also concealed a network of private corridors, service paths, and staff stations that made the mansion function like a well-controlled institution. While the main spaces lifted the visitor into an atmosphere of refined brilliance, hidden mechanisms kept the household operating with near-invisible efficiency. Beneath the surface of elegance, there existed a system engineered for order, discretion, and control, a system that would quietly shape the lives of those who lived and worked within these extraordinary walls. The deeper one moved into the mansion, the more its true nature emerged. The public rooms near the entrance dazzled with symmetry and spectacle, but the real intelligence of the house revealed itself in the spaces visitors rarely saw, an interior order shaped with the precision of a small, self-contained state. The mansion's layout was not simply generous, it was deliberate, structured around a silent choreography that guided residents, staff, and guests through entirely different worlds without letting those worlds collide. The private quarters for the family were arranged with an almost ceremonial hierarchy, each room positioned to reflect status, function, and privacy. The owner's suite occupied the most commanding vantage point, facing the full sweep of the valley, with windows positioned to catch the earliest morning light. The rooms were connected by wide thresholds, designed to create a continuous sense of volume, but they remained isolated enough that their occupants could move through them without ever encountering the rhythms of the household below. Adjacent to this space, though kept slightly apart, lay the rooms designated for the lady of the house. These chambers were shaped by softer lines, elevated ceilings with more decorative accents, and windows arranged to welcome balanced daylight rather than direct glare. Together, the suites formed a paired axis of authority, two centers of gravity around which the rest of the private wing quietly revolved. Beyond these principal rooms, the mansion extended into networks of bedrooms meant for children, relatives, or long-term guests. These spaces, though still refined, were intentionally positioned farther from the main observational points of the house, tucked behind wider corridors that offered privacy while maintaining the visual order that governed the whole floor. The placement of each corridor, each stairway, and each threshold reflected an understanding that different lives unfolded here, some demanding quiet routine, others requiring constant readiness. But the mansion's real genius appeared in the spaces entirely hidden from visitors, the service corridors. These narrow passageways threaded through the home like arteries behind a sculpted façade. They ran parallel to the main corridors, yet were never visible from them, allowing staff to move from room to room without drawing attention. Sharp turns, concealed door panels, and sound-dampening materials made these routes almost inaudible. A servant could deliver firewood, adjust drapery, or prepare a room for evening without ever crossing a guest's line of sight. To a visitor, the mansion felt as if it maintained itself. To those who lived within its structure, these corridors were the secret machinery that kept the illusion intact. Near the heart of this hidden system was the office of the household director, the single most important operational room in the entire residence. Unlike the main study, which existed as a symbol of authority and refinement, this office was pure function, shelves lined with ledgers, schedules pinned to walls, drawers filled with lists of supplies, repair notes, and staff rosters. The director monitored everything: who arrived at the gates, when food deliveries were expected, when linens needed to be rotated, when the greenhouse required more coal, which hallway had to be cleaned before a morning event. This room operated like a command center, silently synchronizing dozens of moving parts. No guest ever entered it, and few even knew it existed. Yet without it, the entire mansion would have collapsed under its own weight. Even within the family areas, subtle separations persisted. There were rooms intended only for brief conversations, rooms meant for reading or writing, rooms where discussions of finances or planning could take place without overheard fragments leaking into common spaces. Door placement and ceiling height contributed to the psychological tone of each environment. Some rooms invited reflection with softened corners and filtered light. Others encouraged decisiveness, shaped by darker woods and firmer geometric lines. Together, they formed a cognitive map, a layout that guided thought as much as movement. What made the mansion remarkable was not its size, but its order. It was a residence arranged with the clarity of a governmental compound, each space assigned a purpose, each pathway designed to manage the flow of people, sound, and activity. Public and private zones were separated as firmly as branches of power. Staff quarters and service systems functioned like an administrative backbone, invisible yet indispensable. Family rooms held their own internal distinctions, each one reinforcing the hierarchy that sustained the household. This was not a home built for casual living. It was a structured environment, a controlled ecosystem where architecture dictated daily life, reinforced social roles, and maintained an unbroken illusion of seamless operation. And yet, for all its precision and structure, the mansion's authority did not end at its walls. Beyond the private wing, beyond the hidden passages, another realm awaited, a landscape crafted with equal intention, where the exterior grounds extended the mansion's power far beyond its stone boundaries. The grounds surrounding the mansion were not conceived as decoration. They were an extension of authority, an outdoor architecture designed with as much precision as the stonework inside. From the moment one stepped beyond the threshold, the landscape unfolded in a series of deliberate gestures, each element placed to reinforce the idea that the estate was not merely built on the land, but orchestrated above it. Terraces descended the slope in calculated tiers, wide enough for gatherings yet aligned so strictly that even their shadows seemed disciplined. Their edges traced clean horizontal lines that contrasted with the natural rise and fall of the terrain, creating a visual boundary between the ordered world of the estate and the wild rhythm of the valley beyond. These terraces connected to a network of axial paths, long straight avenues cut through lawns and framed by rows of trees chosen for their predictable growth. Linden on one side, elm on the other, each branch encouraged into a canopy that formed a tunnel of green in summer and a lattice of silhouettes in winter. These paths directed the gaze toward focal points placed with almost mathematical care: statues, stone urns, small pavilions that stood not as ornaments but as markers of intention. Every step along these lines reinforced the idea that the owner valued precision, control, and continuity. This was not a landscape meant to be rambled through. It was meant to be navigated like a narrative, each turn revealing another layer of curated beauty. Farther from the house, the design perspectives became more dramatic. Shrubs and trees were trimmed to shape optical illusions, making distances appear longer or shorter, depending on the intended effect. A visitor standing at the top of the upper terrace might see the garden stretching like a royal promenade, while from below, the same incline appeared steeper, almost fortified. Beds of roses, arranged in geometric patterns, drew the eye to the estate's boundaries, creating the sense that the mansion's influence extended well beyond its walls. Flowering plants were chosen not only for their colors, but for their timing, ensuring that the landscape moved through seasons like a slow, deliberate performance. Water played a pivotal role in the estate's character. Whether through a lake in the distance, a man-made pond, or a nearby stream, its presence was integrated into the composition to reflect light and anchor the surroundings emotionally. Morning sun cast a shimmer upward, bathing the terraces in soft brightness, while evenings brought darker reflections that gave depth to the estate's perimeter. Water also shaped the climate around the house, cooling the air in summer and carrying the subtle scent of the shoreline toward the garden. To the owner, this connection to water symbolized both stability and reach, an unbroken axis that tied the residence to the broader landscape. The estate's size and intricacy meant constant maintenance. Gardeners trimmed hedges daily, replaced bedding plants through spring and summer, and protected delicate varieties in cold months. The terraces demanded resurfacing, the stonework required continual inspection, and the water features needed regular management to prevent flooding or erosion. This labor was not a burden, but an expected part of preserving an identity. For the owner, the grounds were a statement not just of taste, but of capability, a visible demonstration that resources were abundant enough to sculpt nature itself. Yet, for all the calculation, the landscape harbored a quiet contradiction. Beneath the clean lines and manicured patterns, the natural world never ceased pushing back. Heavy rains carved channels through carefully graded soil. Winds snapped branches that had been shaped with years of effort. Winters brought frosts that seeped into the terraces and widened hairline cracks into structural concerns. Water levels rose and fell unpredictably, reshaping the edges of the shoreline, despite attempts to control it with stone barriers. Each season forced the estate to contend once again with a world indifferent to human design. The gardens may have looked serene, but behind their elegance was a constant negotiation. A reminder that even the most powerful expressions of order could be unsettled by a single storm or a harsh winter. For years, the owner managed to keep nature in check, relying on manpower and resources to preserve the illusion of mastery. But as the estate matured, the balance grew more fragile. The structure dominated the land, yet the land never fully yielded. There was an unspoken tension between the vision carved into the hillside and the forces that shaped the hillside itself. And somewhere within this tension lay the first quiet whisper of what would come. The recognition that even the grandest designs cannot remain unchanged when the natural world begins to press back. Even the greatest estate cannot hold its ground forever if the landscape itself decides to reclaim what was once taken. Each year, as winter loosened its grip on the valley and the first warm winds swept up the hillside, the mansion stirred from its quiet slumber like a giant returning to consciousness. For months it had stood in semi-darkness, shutters fastened, corridors hushed, fireplaces cold, and furniture resting beneath protective covers. Yet nothing inside was abandoned. The moment spring approached, the house shifted from stillness to preparation, as though it sensed the approaching arrival of the family whose presence gave it purpose. The revival began with the staff returning ahead of everyone else. Groundskeepers inspected the terraces for cracks from the frost, clearing fallen branches and debris deposited by winter storms. Gardeners tested the soil, pruned the hedges, and prepared beds for the first blooms. Inside, housemaids moved from room to room in a practice sequence, lighting lamps to chase out the mustiness, opening windows that had been sealed for months, and sweeping away layers of winter dust that settled like a thin memory of silence. Heavy drapes were shaken out. Mirrors were polished until they captured the daylight like water. The mansion did not simply wake, it reassembled itself. Once the final checks were complete, the family's return transformed the house from a structure to a living entity. Their arrival followed a familiar rhythm. Carriages or early automobiles approached along the sweeping road, rolling to a measured stop beneath the grand entrance. Trunks were unloaded, doors swung open, and the echo of footsteps filled the entrance hall. For a moment, the vast interior seemed to inhale. Voices traveled across the marble floors. Laughter bounced off high ceilings. Children darted down corridors they hadn't seen since autumn. Adults paused at windows to reacquaint themselves with the view, one that reminded them why the house stood where it stood. The mansion reacted to these sounds like an awakened creature, each footstep, each breath returning warmth to spaces that had waited patiently. The ritual of opening the season continued over several days. The kitchens came back to life with the rhythmic clang of pots and the warm scent of baking bread. The dining hall regained its ceremonial atmosphere as tables were set with polished silver, crystal glasses, and fresh linens. The music room echoed with the soft hum of instruments being tuned, and in the evenings, firelight flickered along wood-paneled walls, signaling the beginning of long conversations, card games, and quiet reading sessions that stretched late into the night. The estate's first gatherings of the year were always modest but intentional. A tea on the upper terrace to welcome neighboring families. A small evening reception to re-establish social ties that had paused during the winter months. Guests moved through the grand rooms, reacquainting themselves with the familiar grandeur as though greeting an old friend. They admired recent adjustments, perhaps a new painting, a rearranged piece of furniture, or freshly upholstered chairs. These small changes mattered because the mansion was not simply a residence but a social arena where perception played a role as important as hospitality. Through these early events, the house revealed its true design. Every room had a role. The morning room welcomed sunlight and quiet conversation. The music hall carried sound with the ease of a well-tuned instrument. The grand corridor became a place where guests lingered between rooms, admiring the rhythmic alignment of arches. Even the gardens joined the performance, offering blooming paths and manicured lawns as the backdrop for leisurely walks. The mansion operated like a living system, its architecture guiding movement, its sound shaping atmosphere, its layout orchestrating the flow of people with barely visible precision. As the season progressed, activity intensified. Summer gatherings expanded in scale. Musical evenings drew larger crowds. Dinners stretched across hours, accompanied by conversation that floated upward into the high ceilings like a second layer of decoration. On warm nights, lanterns illuminated the terraces, casting long shadows across the stone and making the estate appear almost suspended between earth and sky. The house thrived in these moments, its purpose fulfilled not through quiet solitude, but through the dynamic interplay of voices, footsteps, and the subtle rustling of life moving through its corridors. But with each vibrant season came an underlying truth. The mansion's vitality depended entirely on the presence of the people who animated it. When the family arrived, the house breathed, shone, and asserted its place in the world. When they gathered, it expanded. When they laughed, it resonated. Every room, every corridor, every terrace felt charged with meaning, because the lives inside it gave shape to that meaning. Without them, the structure was impressive, but still. Beautiful, but dormant. Powerful, but silent. And as the years passed, this quiet dependency became more apparent. The estate lived in cycles, bright summers, muted winters, but its true heartbeat was measured not by the seasons of nature, but by the seasons of its owners. This was the mansion's hidden truth, the one embedded in its walls long before anyone noticed it. Such houses do not simply exist. They live only as long as those who inhabit them continue to fill them with purpose. When their presence fades, even the grandest walls begin to feel the first tremors of a life slowly slipping away. Behind the polished floors, the glittering events, and the serenely ordered terraces stood an immense human engine, an army of workers whose combined effort kept the mansion alive. Without them, the estate's beauty would have collapsed into chaos within days. Every morning before dawn, long before the family stirred, and hours before guests appeared, the first members of this unseen force stepped into motion. Their routines formed the pulse of the house, a rhythm so constant and precise that most visitors never realized how many hands shaped the illusion of effortless grandeur. The gardeners were always first. Moving across the grounds with tools slung over their shoulders, they inspected the flower beds, terraces, and gravel paths with the alertness of people responsible for a living organism. Each plant required its own kind of attention, shaping, watering, pruning, testing for early signs of rot or insect damage. Shrubs had to be clipped before irregular growth could distort a carefully maintained perspective. Lawns were trimmed by hand, long rows of grass cut evenly to preserve the estate's perfection. Even the edges of pathways were tended with knives and small shears, because one uneven line could break the visual clarity that defined the grounds. In the greenhouse, the work was even more exacting. Rare plants, protected from the harsh winters, demanded meticulous care, humidity regulated by coal-fired boilers, delicate seedlings transplanted at precise intervals, fragile blossoms shielded against temperature swings. It was a garden, but also a laboratory, and the gardeners, its devoted technicians. Inside the house, the day belonged to the maids, butlers, cooks, laundry workers, and maintenance staff. They moved through a hidden world of passages behind the public rooms, an invisible architecture built into the mansion's skeleton. Narrow hallways ran parallel to the main corridors, allowing staff to slip silently between rooms. Service doors were designed to blend seamlessly into wood-paneled walls, opening only when needed and closing as though they had never existed. Steep staircases led from the basements to the upper floors, their steps worn from years of constant use. Through these ladders of movement, staff traveled unseen, appearing only when summoned and vanishing before their presence disrupted the atmosphere of refinement. The kitchens were their own microcosm, ovens burning from morning until night, preparation tables crowded with ingredients, copper pots polished to a near-mirror sheen. Cooks balanced multiple meals simultaneously, breakfast trays for private rooms, luncheon spreads for the terrace, and elaborate dinners requiring coordination across dozens of small steps. The clatter of knives, the hiss of steam, and the hum of conversation filled these rooms with a kind of controlled urgency. Meals were not simply prepared, they were performances executed with precision. Down in the lowest levels, the work was heavier, harsher, and endless. The mansion depended on a heating system fueled by coal, and that coal had to be shoveled, fed into furnaces, and managed throughout the day. Workers kept the fire at a steady burn, adjusting airflow so the temperature above remained constant. Too much heat risked warping wood paneling or cracking windows, too little chilled the grand rooms. It was a delicate balance maintained through sweat and expertise. Other staff oversaw pumps, boilers, laundry machinery, and electrical systems. Not glamorous tasks, but ones that prevented collapse. Leaks had to be patched before they became floods. Early signs of mold had to be addressed before they spread into the walls. Flickering bulbs needed replacement before guests noticed. Every day brought something new: a jammed window, a stubborn door hinge, a chipped tile, a frayed rug edge. Maintenance was not occasional, it was continuous, a never-ending battle against entropy. The household director coordinated it all from an office tucked deep within the service wing. His walls held charts showing every task scheduled for the week, lists of supplies, and detailed diagrams of the estate's plumbing and electrical networks. He knew which worker handled which responsibility, monitored progress, and dispatched teams to handle problems before anyone outside the staff heard a word about them. This office was the nerve center of the estate, an operational heart that beat quietly, keeping the entire mansion functioning as a unified organism. What made the house remarkable was how invisible all this labor was. Guests saw shimmering chandeliers, pristine floors, and immaculate gardens. They saw meals arrive as if summoned by thought, rooms refreshed without interruption, and events unfolding with smooth elegance. They did not see the dozens of people rising before dawn, the constant repairs, the heat of the boiler rooms, the strain of repetitive tasks. And that was the point. The mansion's beauty rested on a foundation of labor carefully hidden from view. But such an enormous system, no matter how elegant, was fragile. It required every part to work, every gardener, every worker, every maid, every furnace, every pipe, every carefully timed schedule. There was no slack in the machinery, no spare space for failure. A single interruption could ripple outward, disrupting the finely tuned sequence that kept the estate alive. Even one missing worker could strain the others. One damaged boiler could leave rooms cold. One storm could undo a week's worth of garden labor. It was a living empire built on precision, and like all empires, its strength depended on constant vigilance. The house thrived as long as the system held, but systems made of people, metal, and stone eventually falter. And when the first cracks appeared, small, almost imperceptible at first, the grandeur above began to tremble in ways no visitor could yet see. The estate that once seemed invincible was only beginning to reveal how vulnerable its magnificence truly was. Change did not arrive with a dramatic storm or a sudden collapse. It came quietly, slipping through the mansion's routines the way a draft sneaks beneath a door, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, yet persistent enough to signal the beginning of a shift. For years, the estate had operated like a grand, perfectly tuned machine, but even the most powerful structures can be undone by forces too gradual to notice until they begin leaving marks. The first signs appeared in the estate's ledgers. taxes on large properties crept upward, inch by inch, as nearby towns expanded and authorities recalculated land value. What had once been a manageable expense grew steadily into a burden, particularly when paired with rising costs of fuel and imported materials. Maintaining the terraces, repairing stonework, and replacing aging infrastructure required more money each year. The estate had always been expensive, but now it demanded attention that even its wealthy owners felt more keenly. These numbers, buried in documents and quietly discussed behind closed doors, represented the earliest fractures, hairline cracks in a structure that had been built on the expectation of uninterrupted prosperity. At the same time, the world beyond the estate's gates was changing. Families who once prided themselves on large households and an abundance of staff began rethinking the model. The social climate was shifting. Younger generations sought different lives. Fewer people were willing to spend their days scrubbing floors, hauling coal, or maintaining endless gardens. Factories offered steadier wages. Offices offered more independence. Opportunities outside domestic service grew, and with them came the challenge of retaining workers who had long formed the backbone of the estate. A household that once needed dozens now struggled to staff even essential positions. Rooms were cleaned less frequently, repairs took longer. Tasks that were once invisible began to leave small but noticeable traces. Inside the mansion, the physical structure itself started revealing its age. Wood settled unevenly after decades of seasonal expansion and contraction. Doors that once swung smoothly began to stick. Paint showed thin networks of cracks where the walls met the ceiling. Stone on the terraces, subjected to decades of freeze and thaw, loosened by fractions of inches. The roof, once an impenetrable shield, developed leaks during heavy rainfall. Small spots at first, but enough to require buckets discreetly placed beneath the drips until repairs could be made. Though none of these issues were catastrophic, each one eroded the illusion of permanence. Below the surface, the mansion's mechanical systems, so cutting edge in their era, began to show their limitations. Boilers that had powered the house through long winters grew unreliable. Iron pipes, unseen behind walls, corroded slowly, leaving faint metallic tastes in the water, or reducing flow in certain wings. Electrical systems buzzed or flickered under strain, as new appliances and lighting placed demands on circuits never designed to support them. The hidden network that once allowed the staff to maintain silence and efficiency now required constant attention merely to stay functional. Even the gardens, symbols of order imposed upon nature, revealed small betrayals. Harsh seasons damaged shrubs that had weathered decades with ease. Soil along the terraces compacted unevenly, leading to subtle shifts in slope. Aesthetic symmetry, once maintained flawlessly, began to slip as the number of groundskeepers dwindled. Nature, patient but persistent, responded to neglect with vines reaching into cracks and roots pushing beneath stones. The estate was still beautiful, still awe-inspiring, but its edges softened in ways that suggested a slow retreat from its former rigor. These changes did not announce themselves loudly. They accumulated like sediment, quiet, steady, and heavy. Visitors still saw grandeur. Parties were still held, though perhaps slightly smaller. The house still glowed in the evenings, its windows reflecting golden light across the terraces. But the staff knew the truth. The family sensed it too. The effort required to keep everything running grew larger each season, like the slow tightening of a vise. The mansion had not yet begun to fall, but the first seams had started to loosen. The estate stood not in visible danger, but in a precarious balance where every small deficiency hinted at a future in which the house might no longer be able to sustain itself. These early fractures were warnings, subtle but unmistakable, and soon enough, the quiet pressures that had been building for years would meet far more powerful forces, events so heavy, so disruptive, that no amount of labor or wealth could repair the damage once it began. Storms had always swept across the valley, but for decades the mansion had met them with confidence. Its terraces held firm, its stone walls resisted wind, and its roof shed rain like a creature built for the elements. Yet everything ages, even foundations carved from rock. And as the years progressed, the natural world began to test the estate with a persistence that went far beyond the quiet strains of earlier seasons. What once felt like routine weather patterns slowly shifted into something more aggressive. Storms that arrived with the determination of a force intent on reclaiming what the mansion had taken from the hillside. The first major blow came during a late autumn gale that tore across the region with little warning. Winds rolled down the mountain slope with a strength that bent trees nearly to the ground. Branches snapped like twigs and scattered across the terraces. Hours of rain lashed the stonework, seeping through weak points that had gone unnoticed. For the first time, water breached the upper garden walls, spilling onto pathways and muddy streams. The estate's drainage system, once designed with elegance and foresight, strained under the sudden pressure. Workers waded through rising pools with lanterns held high, trying to redirect the flow before it reached the house itself. They succeeded, but only just. That storm left its mark. Sections of the retaining walls had shifted by fractions of inches, invisible to anyone but the maintenance crew. Cracks emerged in the stone lining the lower terraces, small at first, but expanding with every freeze that followed. The shoreline bore the worst of the damage. Waves, driven by brutal winds, hammered the breakwater with relentless force. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds were pried loose and dragged into the lake, leaving jagged gaps that exposed the soft earth behind them. In the calm that followed, it became clear that the water had crept several feet inland. The shoreline that had once shaped the view from the terraces no longer matched the drawings or the memories of the family who had built the estate. Repairs began immediately. Masonry teams patched walls and replaced stone along the terraces. Laborers hauled new rock to reinforce the shoreline, working knee-deep in cold water as waves continued to challenge their progress. The cost was immense, and only a temporary fix. Within a year, another storm arrived, undoing weeks of labor in a single night. Water surged into the boathouse, lifting planks and soaking the interior. Wooden beams, long accustomed to cycles of dampness and drying, began to rot in places previously untouched. Salt carried inland by wind burned delicate plants, leaving swaths of the garden pale and brittle. Winter snow settled over a landscape that felt wounded. The cycle repeated itself. Each year brought a new sequence of heavy rains, strong winds, or sudden temperature swings. Roots of trees near the terraces loosened as soil eroded beneath them. Branches crashed onto stone paths during storms, cracking flagstones that had once seemed unbreakable. The top layers of the terraces shifted subtly, undermined by the constant pressure of water. Even the mansion's roof, built to withstand decades of harsh seasons, began to falter as storms pushed water beneath shingles and into the upper floors. Workers placed buckets in attics, patched beams, and reinforced rafters, but the damage always returned in some form, each repair a reminder that the house was losing its battle against forces greater than any design could anticipate. Inside, the struggles were quieter, but equally relentless. Humidity seeped into walls, creating faint patches that spread behind paneling. Wooden window frames swelled after storms, sticking stubbornly until carpenters adjusted them again and again. Stone thresholds absorbed moisture that crept upward over time, creating a cold dampness that no amount of heating could fully dispel. The mansion was still majestic, still commanding, but the effort required to maintain its glory grew heavier with each passing season. What made the situation even more daunting was that every repair carried consequences. Strengthening one section of the terrace put strain on another. Reinforcing the shoreline redirected water in unpredictable ways. Fixing leaks in the roof meant discovering new vulnerabilities in the walls. Nature was not attacking the estate head-on. It was wearing it down from every side, piece by piece, using time and weather as tools to slowly dismantle what had once appeared eternal. The estate's defenders, the staff, the family, the craftsmen, fought valiantly, year after year. But the mansion had become a structure in constant negotiation with the natural world, a negotiation it was steadily losing. The storms exposed weaknesses. The shifting shoreline threatened the foundation of the gardens. The persistent moisture corroded materials that had once embodied permanence. By the time the worst of the damage became impossible to deny, the house still stood, tall and impressive as ever from a distance. Yet up close, its vulnerabilities were clear. Every stone held a memory of pressure. Every wall bore the faint trace of a battle fought against water, wind, and the slow, unyielding force of erosion. The mansion had not collapsed, but it had changed. It had become a place where beauty and fragility existed side by side, a place where each attempt to preserve its grandeur revealed new evidence that the house was beginning to turn against itself. It remained magnificent, but no longer secure, proud, but no longer invincible. And beneath its towering presence, a quiet truth settled in. The house that once dominated the land now stood as both triumph and threat, still rising against the sky, yet increasingly undone by the very forces it had tried to command. As the storms grew stronger and the repairs more frequent, the mansion entered a new era, one defined not by expansion or celebration, but by concession. The family, once confident in its ability to command the estate with wealth and willpower, found itself struggling against a tide of obligations that seemed to grow heavier with every passing year. What had begun as minor financial strain now hardened into an undeniable reality. The cost of sustaining such grandeur had surpassed the resources available to preserve it. The first sacrifices were subtle. A few acres of land along the outer edges of the property were surveyed, divided, and sold to neighboring families who wished for a piece of its storied landscape. These parcels might once have seemed insignificant compared to the vastness of the original grounds, but their sale marked a psychological shift. Boundaries that had stood unchanged for decades began to shrink, revealing a slow retreat, an admission that the estate's reach could no longer remain untouched. Inside the mansion, the changes were even more evident. Wings that had once hosted guests and housed lively gatherings were quietly closed off. Heavy doors were locked to conserve heat, and dust covers returned to rooms that had been vibrant parts of the home's social identity. Fireplaces once tended daily, now sat cold for entire seasons. Chandeliers, which had illuminated countless evenings with warm, glittering light, were carefully taken down and wrapped for sale. Their removal left behind empty hooks and pale outlines on ceilings, ghostly reminders of luxury fading from the space. Furniture followed. Chairs, tables, cabinets, and decorative pieces that had been chosen with pride during the estate's brightest years were packed into crates and sent to auction houses. The grand hall, once a place where music drifted between columns, gradually lost the items that had defined its character. Without them, the room felt larger, yet strangely diminished, as though the air inside had thickened with absence. Carpets worn from decades of foot traffic were rolled up and sold, leaving bare floors that echoed with the slightest sound. The financial decisions, though practical, carried a silent grief. Each sale chipped away at the owner's relationship with the house, turning memories into commodities. But for the family, there was no alternative. Maintenance on this scale required a staff far larger than anyone could justify, and by now, the workforce had thinned drastically. Tasks once handled by teams were forced onto a handful of workers who could not keep pace with the estate's demands. The terraces sagged where soil had eroded beneath the stones. Paint peeled from window frames no one had time to repair. The gardens lost their precision as weeds pushed through edges once trimmed to perfection. Rooms dimmed as bulbs were left unchanged and fixtures removed. Corridors grew quieter as fewer people walked their length. The mansion, once alive with movement and conversation, began to feel like a hollowed relic of a grander time. At night, the house seemed darker than it should have been. Shadows pooling where lamps once stood, corners vanishing into silence. Even the sound of the wind around the eaves felt different, more intrusive, as though the house no longer possessed the strength to hold it at bay. Yet the decline was not a single dramatic fall, it was a slow unraveling. There was no moment when the mansion simply stopped functioning. Instead, each year revealed a little more exhaustion in its structure. Roof beams sagged just slightly more. Cracks in plaster extended another inch. Wooden banisters lost their sheen. Rooms that had once housed laughter now carried only the faint echo of footsteps and the scent of aging timber. Visitors who had known the house in its prime spoke softly when they returned, their admiration tempered by an unspoken sadness. They still saw beauty. How could they not? But it was a beauty touched by fragility, a kind of fading nobility that asked not for praise but for remembrance. The family felt this even more acutely. Walking through the halls meant confronting what had been lost, the gatherings, the vitality, the certainty of a future built on stability. Now, the future felt as if it belonged to someone else. Despite the estate's diminishing state, there remained corners untouched by the decline, quiet pockets that held their mysteries close. Hidden storage rooms still contained objects never displayed. Old journals and ledgers lay tucked in drawers behind locked doors. Secret pathways constructed for staff still wound through the walls, half forgotten but intact. And beneath the floors, behind paneling, or inside sealed cabinets, whispers of the mansion's past lingered. Clues to a world shaped by wealth, ambition, and decisions long buried. The mansion was fading, but it did not fade cleanly. Even as its brilliance dulled and its rooms fell quiet, it clung to its secrets. And as the family withdrew, selling what they could and closing what they could not sustain, the house seemed determined to keep certain truths hidden until the very end. By the time the estate's decline could no longer be denied, the mansion had already begun to scatter itself across the region in fragments, pieces of a once mighty whole drifting into new lives. What remained was not a structure, but a constellation of artifacts, each one carrying a sliver of the grandeur that had once defined the property. The house had been too vast, too intricate, too saturated with history to vanish entirely. Instead, it slowly dissolved into objects, papers, memories, and half-forgotten traces that survived long after the walls themselves weakened. The first to endure were the photographs. Some were taken deliberately. Portraits staged in the grand hall or on the terrace, formal compositions that captured the estate at its height. Others were simple family snapshots, corners of the mansion appearing in the background almost by accident. Over the years, these images found their way into albums, drawers, attics, or generational boxes sealed by time. Eventually, when the estate was no longer recognizable, these photographs resurfaced in auctions, historical collections, and private archives. Each image became a portal into a vanished world, a garden in perfect bloom, a sunlit corridor stretching beneath towering ceilings, a gathering of guests dressed for summer. The photographs, fragile as they were, carried more permanence than the stone that once framed those scenes. Alongside the images, the architectural plans survived in varying degrees of completeness. Original blueprints, inked with meticulous lines, endured in storage folders or records offices. Some were brittle, their edges frayed. Others preserved astonishing detail, room dimensions, decorative motifs, the paths of hidden corridors. Students of architecture, historians, and curious descendants studied them to reconstruct the mansion in their minds. These documents, never meant for public display, had become some of the last authoritative testimonies of what the estate once was. They revealed the logic behind the layout, the intention behind the symmetry, the intelligence behind decisions now lost to time. The interior did not vanish all at once. Pieces were removed during the years of decline and found new homes far from the mansion's grounds. A carved mantelpiece ended up in a house miles away, where its intricate designs became a conversation starter, without any mention of their origin. A set of leaded glass panels that once filtered morning light into the dining room was installed in an upscale restaurant, admired by patrons who had no idea they were looking at fragments of a forgotten estate. Chandeliers that once illuminated orchestral evenings now hung above staircases in renovated townhouses, casting their soft glow on walls that had never known the mansion's grandeur. Even pieces of furniture, chairs, dressers, tables, continued their lives quietly, their provenance known to only a few. Outside, the traces were more weathered, but still present. Sections of garden walls remained buried beneath vines, their original symmetry long erased yet recognizable in outline. Stone balustrades, cracked by decades of frost, lay partially sunken in soil. Terraces had collapsed in places, leaving stepped shapes faintly visible beneath layers of earth and moss. Here and there, a foundation stone still bore the marks of chisel work, a subtle reminder of the craftsmanship that once shaped the estate. Nature had reclaimed these fragments, softening their edges until they seemed part of the hillside itself, a reminder that landscapes often remember what architecture forgets. Even the shoreline held remnants of the estate's former strength. Bits of the breakwater, the massive stones once placed to defend the grounds from storms, could still be found scattered along the water's edge. Time had worn them smooth, and many lay half submerged, forming quiet pools where birds landed, or where the lake lapped gently during calm weather. To an untrained eye, they looked like natural formations, but for those who knew the estate's history, They were unmistakably human, markers of an era when people believed they could command the power of wind and water. Together, these remnants formed a mosaic of memory rather than a structure, pieces of a puzzle that could never again be assembled in full. The mansion itself had vanished from the landscape, but its shadow persisted in the photographs people kept, the fragments displayed in new homes, and the documents stored in climate-controlled archives. Even the stories passed down through generations acted as artifacts, shaping how the estate was remembered long after its physical presence faded. And in this patchwork of surviving pieces, a deeper truth revealed itself. Sometimes the legacy of a great house is not held in the walls that eventually crumble, or the rooms that fall silent. It is held in what escapes the ruin, objects, images, memories, and impressions that drift outward into the world and take on a life of their own. Sometimes what endures is not the stone, but the echo it leaves behind. As the physical traces of the mansion scattered and disappeared, something unexpected began to take shape in their absence. A second version of the estate, one made not of stone, but of memory, myth, and misunderstanding. The grand house that had once towered confidently over the valley gradually transformed into an architectural ghost, no longer anchored to the hillside, but lingering in conversations, old journals, newspaper clippings, and half-forgotten recollections passed down through families who had once lived nearby. What remained in the public consciousness was not a precise description, but an evolving portrait shaped by rumor, nostalgia, and gaps in the historical record. Stories about the mansion survived in fragments. Some came from elderly residents who remembered the glow of its windows on summer nights, or the echo of music drifting down the slope. Others emerged from descendants of former staff, recounting tales of hidden passageways or secret rooms they claimed once held valuables or private documents. Over time, these accounts blended into one another, losing their edges and gaining theatrical qualities. A mundane service corridor became a tunnel system. A locked storage room became a sealed chamber. The mansion's size, already impressive, grew larger in the retelling, and the grandeur of its halls expanded with each new narrator. Newspaper archives contributed to the confusion. Articles referenced the estate by different names, sometimes misattributing its construction to the wrong branch of a prominent family. In certain reports, the house was linked to individuals who had never set foot inside it, while others credited it with hosting events it never actually accommodated. Editors repeated errors, journalists embellished details, and over time these inaccuracies layered themselves into a kaleidoscope of inconsistent narratives. Even historians attempting to piece together the building's lineage found themselves navigating conflicting sources, each tinted by the bias or memory of the person who recorded it. The mansion's decline only amplified its mythological status. As the real structure lost the power to correct misunderstandings, the stories surrounding it grew bolder. Some claimed the owners abandoned it abruptly due to an undisclosed scandal, an interpretation fueled by the fact that sections of the house had been closed and sold quietly. Others insisted the estate had been cursed by its location, pointing to the relentless storms that battered the shoreline in its later years. The truth was far more practical, but the dramatic versions proved more resilient. People prefer legends that explain grandeur with equal grandeur. Even the surviving fragments of the estate fed into its spectral reputation. A carved mantle discovered in a private home sparked speculation about hidden wealth. A set of stained glass panels found in an antique shop inspired theories that the family had fled suddenly, leaving treasures behind. When architectural plans surfaced decades later, the presence of concealed hallways and servant passages was interpreted as evidence of clandestine activities, rather than the practical necessities of managing a large household. Each artifact became a clue, and every clue transformed into an invitation for storytelling. The lack of a single authoritative narrative made the mansion more mysterious, not less. Without its physical mass to anchor it, the estate became a vessel for imagination. Tourists asked about it during visits to nearby towns. Local guides pointed to the hillside and offered competing versions of what once stood there. Residents debated details: how many rooms it had, how large the grounds were, why the family left, what became of the final owners. The house had become a collective invention, shaped not by bricks, but by the human instinct to fill empty spaces with meaning. And yet, these myths were not simply distortions. They represented the enduring influence of a place that had once dominated its surroundings. The mansion may have vanished from the land, but it had not vanished from memory. If anything, its absence intensified its presence. People seemed drawn to the idea of a grand estate lost to time, as if the disappearance itself elevated it beyond the reach of ordinary history. The house lived on as a ghost, not because it was forgotten, but because it refused to be contained by the facts of its construction and decline. The estate's legend became its most permanent form. Whispered stories, misremembered accounts, and embellished retellings ensured that the mansion survived in the imagination long after its stones had weathered away. It was no longer a place one could visit. It was a place one could only picture, a structure rebuilt again and again in the minds of those who spoke its name, whether accurately or not. And in that transformation, something remarkable occurred. The house ceased to be a relic of a wealthy family or a monument of architectural ambition. It became a symbol, a memory too compelling to fully release. The mansion had disappeared from the hillside, but the influence it cast, its image, its mythology, its gravity, remained. In the decades since the mansion vanished from the hillside, its story has taken on a meaning far greater than the fate of a single estate. The rise, decline, and disappearance of this grand house mirror the trajectory of countless American mansions built during eras of optimism, ambition, and unrestrained wealth. These structures were conceived as monuments to permanence, yet their histories reveal something far more universal. The fragility of grandeur and the ways in which prosperity, once assumed to be enduring, can dissolve with surprising speed. The mansion's story resonates today because it represents a pattern that played out across the country. Throughout the Gilded Age and into the early 20th century, families built remarkable estates, properties designed to project influence, taste, and social authority. They used the finest materials, hired celebrated architects, and imagined their creations would stand for generations. But very few of these mansions actually survived their creators. They were constructed for a way of life that depended on large staffs, constant investment, and a social structure that has long since faded. When taxes rose, household labor changed, and economic tides shifted, even the wealthiest families struggled to sustain their palaces. Over time, many of these estates were demolished, burned, subdivided, or quietly abandoned until only fragments remained. In the mansion's decline, we see a reflection of what happens when architecture built for excess encounters a world striving for practicality. The lavish rooms that once embodied privilege became liabilities in an age where efficiency mattered more than spectacle. The intricate gardens, which required endless labor to maintain, became unmanageable when fewer hands were available. Ornate façades, once symbols of status, became reminders of a past that no longer aligned with the values of a society moving rapidly toward modernity. The disappearance of such houses is not just a matter of economics. It is a shift in cultural priorities, where the meanings assigned to wealth, space, and privacy evolve in ways their builders could not have imagined. The mansion's story also challenges our understanding of time. Buildings are often seen as anchors, objects that resist the current of history, yet the estate demonstrates that even the most imposing structures are vulnerable to the slow erosion of relevance. The forces that brought it into existence, industrial fortunes, social rituals, and architectural bravado, were powerful but not permanent. As these forces weakened, the house lost the context that had once justified its scale. Without that context, even stone feels unstable. Time, left unchecked, dismantles everything, first through subtle shifts, then through undeniable fractures, and finally through disappearance. And yet, the mansion's importance today lies not in its survival, but in its afterlife. Though the physical structure has vanished, its story endures in the memories, myths, photographs, and fragments it left behind. In this sense, the estate offers a lesson about the nature of human memory and what we choose to preserve. We rarely remember buildings purely for their size or materials. We remember them for the stories they held, the lives lived within, the gatherings they hosted, the impressions they made on those who passed through their gates. A mansion becomes meaningful not because of its walls, but because of the emotions, ambitions, and conflicts those walls once contained. The story also invites reflection on how America has handled its architectural monuments. Unlike many countries that enshrine their grand houses as heritage sites, the United States has often allowed its great estates to fade, making way for new construction, or simply succumbing to neglect. The rapid economic cycles and cultural shifts that define American history leave little room for maintaining symbols of past wealth unless they can justify themselves in the present. As a result, countless mansions have vanished, taking with them chapters of local and national history. Their disappearance speaks to a uniquely American relationship with legacy, one that values innovation and reinvention, but sometimes overlooks the importance of remembering what came before. Ultimately, the mansion matters today because its story is not just a tale of architecture. It is a reflection of how certain eras rise and fall, how privilege shapes landscapes, and how the physical symbols of wealth eventually yield to forces larger than themselves. It reveals how quickly cultural priorities can transform and how memory fills the void left by vanished spaces. Its absence is a reminder that monuments, no matter how grand, survive only as long as people care enough to preserve them, and that once they disappear, what remains is dependent on the stories we choose to pass forward. And this story, like so many others tied to the great estates of America, urges us to consider not just the fate of one mansion, but the broader question of how a nation engages with the monuments it builds, the histories it inherits, and the legacy it allows to slip quietly into the past. Even in its absence, the mansion continues to shape the land around it. The hillside where it once stood still carries the faint imprint of terraces that controlled the slope, their outlines softened yet unmistakable to anyone who knows where to look. The trees planted in precise rows long ago have grown wild now, but they still follow the geometry first imposed upon them, nature honoring a structure that no longer exists. Footpaths and property lines trace patterns set over a century earlier. The landscape remembers what the eye can no longer see. More than that, the estate's influence lingers in the architecture of the region. Homes built decades after the mansion's decline borrowed elements from its design without fully realizing the source of their inspiration. Wide gables, extended roof lines, and symmetrical facades echo the principles that once defined the great house. Even local public buildings, schools, libraries, small municipal halls, show traces of its proportions and stylistic choices. The mansion established a language of form and presence, and that language seeped quietly into the surrounding built environment. What began as one family's vision slowly evolved into a cultural template, a model that reshaped the aesthetic identity of an entire area. The ideals behind the mansion also endure. Its creators sought grandeur, yes, but they also pursued mastery over land, light, and space. They believed architecture could project stability and identity, and that belief influenced others long after the estate fell into ruin. Developers, architects, and homeowners still reference the old estate style when envisioning new projects, drawing inspiration from a house they may have never seen and whose photographs they may not recognize. Through these echoes, the mansion exerts a kind of silent authority, a reminder that the ideas born within its walls did not fade with the collapse of its roof. But perhaps its greatest influence lies in the legend that surrounds it. The stories, some factual, some imagined, continue to circulate. They move between generations, travel through families, appear in local history groups, surface in online archives, and emerge in conversations about places that once held power. These stories give the mansion a presence more vivid than its physical form ever was. People picture it as they wish to imagine it, grander, larger, more mysterious, shaped by their own interpretations of what a vanished estate must have been. In this way, the house lives on not as a ruin, but as an evolving idea, one that shifts with each person who tells it. In a strange, poetic way, the mansion's destruction amplified its influence. Had it survived intact, it might have become a museum or a private residence sealed behind gates. Instead, its absence turned it into something more expansive. Without walls to confine it, the house occupies the collective memory of the community. People speak of it with a mix of admiration and melancholy, as if mourning not only the loss of a building, but the vanishing of an entire era. They look to the hillside and imagine what once stood there, filling the empty space with their own sense of wonder. Even the physical void where the mansion once rose has become meaningful. It shapes the experience of the landscape the way a missing tooth shapes the contours of a smile. The absence is palpable. It draws the eye, sparks curiosity, invites reflection. Visitors still climb the slope, searching for what remains, discovering scattered stones or fragments of old foundations, and feeling for a moment the presence of something larger than themselves. Standing there, one senses not just what was lost, but what endures. The ambition, the artistry, the determination to create something extraordinary. And so, the mansion remains, a force without form, a structure without walls, a story without end. It continues to guide imagination, influence design, and shape the land even after its physical presence has faded into memory. It proves that a house can die without disappearing, that architecture can crumble yet continue to command, and that some creations become more powerful in their ruin than they ever were in their prime. In the end, the mansion teaches a final, enduring truth. Even a destroyed home can remain a ruler, of minds, of stories, of landscapes, leaving behind an imprint so deep that time itself cannot fully erase it.